basic income we've got. He also opposes the minimum wage for workers. And you heard what I was just saying about what's happening for workers right now. Yeah, so we've got no minimum wage at $15.75 an hour, that's low enough. Take that away, so no floor there. And he also, I saw in his election policy today, talks about decent housing for decent people. You can't get much more paternalistic than that. We come to, I think, the party of many people in this room, Labour Party.
The opportunity.
And of course, I think when I saw that Labour had, a guy spoke about it just now, Labour invited a guy over here last year, and Grant Robertson and Andrew Little were waxing lyrical very briefly. And I thought in a rather confused manner. It was very hard to get a grip, and I don't know about Grant, but I don't think that Mr. Little had a grip on it at all from what he was saying. I don't think he understood it. And as Guy has said, it's really disappeared, and any Labour people here can correct me if I'm wrong, but I've seen nothing of basic income from Labour since then. I'm also waiting with bated breath for Labour's welfare policy, because are they actually going to change anything of this brutal punitive system that we've got that has applied the social investment principle so deeply to keeping people off benefits, to getting them off benefits, to reducing the amount people can get to the bare minimum or nothing. So people, as Guy talks about a lot, people are too frightened to apply even for the bare welfare that they can theoretically get because of the way they're treated down at working income. Will Labour do anything about that? I'd really love you Labour people to challenge your own party on this in the next few weeks. So I'll wait to see what happens in that space. Now my former party, the Greens, is the other interesting case here. And they made a very courageous move, as I think the whole country knows, some weeks back, in announcing a very brave welfare policy, which did take a big step forward that hasn't been taken in this, well, in my lifetime actually, in terms of changing the welfare system in quite a serious way. But the opportunity got blown, not just because of, well, it was very courageous, it didn't play out in a good way. I don't think anyone can say that it did. But I also tried to talk to a couple of people earlier on who were talking to me from inside the Greens about the fact that, for example, the welfare policy they did put up, it doesn't go to basic income at all. And I asked them why. Like, why aren't they doing anything in there? They could have. Rather than have a policy which said that, for example, getting around the whole issue of relationships and the nature of marriage and the prying of the state and all that, great issue to tackle. But their answer is that people should be able to stay on a benefit for 3 years, on a sole parent's benefit for 3 years into a relationship. I find that quite difficult. I think it would be much cleaner for the Greens to have looked at a basic income than to have gone to that kind of very messy answer to a very difficult problem. Basic income gets around so much of that. And I'm sorry that the Greens, as far as I can see, are still stuck at the place we got to at the end of 1999 at the Green Party Policy Conference, where I don't know if anyone was there?
Well, I wasn't there, but I know about it.
Yeah, where we formed a line across the room. We had a massive debate on basic universal, what we called universal basic income at that time, with people like me down one end and Jeanette Fitzsimons down the other, and the party stretched out in between, and the party, we just could not agree, and that policy is still there, that the Green Party will only go as far as saying that government should investigate a universal basic income if they got into power. And so the Greens too need to be a lot more courageous and a lot clearer on this, and deserve just as much of a challenge as Labour or any other party does on it. So what you said in there, Guy, talking about Roosevelt and the need for pressure to come onto the politicians, that absolutely is what needs to happen in Aotearoa as well. We've only got we can't do much in this few weeks before the election. But I hear that, as Phil and others have said, there's good news from the Labour side of the fence tonight, and I really hope the Greens do get back in there alongside Labour with enough votes to really have a voice as well, because I think if the Green voice is lost, it will be devastating, and that Labour only works with New Zealand First. I would love to see a Labour-free government without NZF, and I would love to see the pressure created from our side of the political fence for a progressive basic income in this country to work together on, I'd like to see more than one pilot, both on pilots, but also on you know, on the longer term meta picture, and try to really work with people on the ground, the kind of people that unions work with, that Auckland Action Against Poverty works with, to explain and engender and encourage and nurture the concept of basic income as a way forward, not just from a privileged elite like most of us probably, but among people, the people that groups work with on the ground, because through that kind of movement building, campaigning and pressure, we could really begin to put pressure on those political partners should they become part of government. Kia ora, people.
Well, first of all, I think you'll all agree that our two comments or discussants have given us really fantastic value added. So I really thank both Sue and Keith. I think a really key point that Keith has made more eloquently than I did, in the sense of stressing this idea of a public equity dividend. The term I've also used, I think social dividend or public equity dividend, it captures the essence of where I think we can win the debate. Because it's basically about sharing capital and sharing the wealth being generated by a system of rentier capitalism. And that's what we're faced with today. And we must realize that real wages, on average, have been stagnating across the world in the OECD countries for 30 years. And they will continue to stagnate for very good reasons that every economist understands. A global convergence is taking place. Real wages are gradually rising in India, and these vast economies, their productivity is going up, and our wages will not rise by much. We've got to have a new income distribution system. And a basic income, or moving in that direction, is very important. One whole area that I didn't discuss, and neither Sue nor Keith discussed, but one which is actually at the moment the most dominant issue in connection with basic income. What is it? The robots. And the argument, of course, for many of these Silicon Valley people for coming out in favor of basic income is they envisage a future in which the robots are replacing us all, we're all redundant, and all the income will go to the owners of robots, and we'll have mass unemployment. I don't personally agree with that lump of labour fallacy. I think there's going to be plenty of other things for us to do, plenty of work for generations. We have more jobs in the world than at any time in history, and yet our technological advances have been phenomenal. But I do think the technological revolution is worsening the tendencies of inequality and rentier capitalism, and are accentuating the need for changing the distribution system. So I think saying, yeah, the robots are an issue, Mr. Zuckerberg or whoever it might be, but not for the reasons that you're claiming. The reason is because you are taking all the money. And a basic income is a way of saying, let's have some of that back for the public equity dividends. And I think we will win that argument. So thank you very much.
Allow us to have a brief break while we get the debate teams together. And can we use that time, if you wish, to ask some questions to any of the panel? I know these debate guys to come forward. Are there questions from the audience? So you guys are coming out. Yeah. Here you go.
Question for you, Kim. I think your figures are a little bit naive. $75 a week. Like, I'm fortunate enough in Europe with my wife, and we get substantially more than that. And you say 33% tax. Yeah. Is that across the board? Is the 175 taxable, or?
No, but at the moment, if you're earning more than $70,000 a year, you you are in effect paying 33% tax and getting 175 back. Okay. Now, if you're a superannuitant, for example, that's not some kind of maximum benefit or anything like that. So it wouldn't. But anyone who's over 65 in New Zealand gets at least 175 back. In fact, somewhat more than that.
Yeah, but
So-
Can we-
175 is not livable. What I was going
No,
to
it's not meant to
suggest
be.
How much would you increase it if you had a capital gains tax and you had all those tax write-offs that people can have if they own
That's a democratic question that's to be discussed in society. So it's not a question that I want to even contemplate asking how much I would raise taxes by to pay a bigger public equity dividend. All I'm just saying is that at the moment, the cost of doing that is almost around about the same cost as that of the Joyce budget package. That's it.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I know there's lots of questions in the audience, and the next stage of our thing is the debate, and I've got the two speakers, the lead speakers for their respective positions here now. Which one of you is going to do this? And you are from the affirming team. Sorry. Yeah.
Speeches are 5 minutes, right?
Yeah.
I realise I stand here tonight with a receptive audience, but that doesn't change the fact that there are two truths that flow from this debate. The first is that labour is changing and is in terminal decline, that the increasing prevalence of robots in the workforce isn't just the case that labour is changing, but it is going to disappear. We can't say that a flurry of service-in jobs are going to be here forever. It is the case that we are moving more towards a post-work world. The second truth is one more horrible, which is a reflection on our welfare system, one that constantly deprives the most needy and vulnerable in our society of the support they need and deserve, and that it's born from a system of many exceptions and conditions that people have to meet. What we stand for then on side affirmative is a basic income. And what that looks like is giving it to children once they reach the age of 16, and then before then we count them to some sort of optimal proportion which is passed on to their parents because they bear the cost of raising those children. In terms of how we fund this, we do it through higher taxation, but also a broader base of taxation, so things like estate tax or capital gains. And keep in mind, when the side negative says that it's going to cost too much, cost is a shorthand used by the right to say that they don't want to bear any tax increases. We are happy to see the most wealthy bear the cost of this policy. Finally, we'll give it to citizens as well. We think that's perfectly reasonable in line with basic income across the world. I'm going to make 3 arguments in this speech. The first is why this makes the provision of welfare more humane. The second is why this is a necessary solution to a changing workforce. And the final argument is why this makes the provision of welfare more efficient. And second, Aditya is going to tell you about how this provides security and the value there. First point then, why is it the case this makes welfare more humane? Largely one of the things that basic income does in a lot of conceptions, and one we prefer, is that it replaces a system of transfers currently provided by the state based on some conditions. Currently the provision of welfare is one that is tied to massive stigma, both internally and externally. What does that internal stigma looks like? That looks like going to BINZ in the morning and having to deal with a case manager, pleading for a benefit and trying to say that you meet the criteria. They're increasingly becoming more stringent. Sue was right. The social investment model pursued by this national government has made it increasingly hard to access a benefit from increasingly callous case managers. What does that mean then? It means that there's a massive personal attack on your dignity as a person. It forces you to jump through hoops that you shouldn't have to, and it makes you feel as though you aren't a worthy human being, based on ill-defined criteria that you feel as though you have to lie about because you know you desperately need the support, but you're never going to meet the absurd standards set by this government. It's a terrible pain to bear for people. We don't think it's one they should reasonably bear. The next thing that happens, though, is the external stigma that's predicted from welfare currently. It is a political fact that the way beneficiaries are conceived in New Zealand today is disgusting across the world. It's that these people are fundamentally lazy and that a whole host of other contributing factors, like your background, like your access to essential services, whether or not you're exposed to violence as a child, will have much more of an impact than any sort of personal work ethos that likes to be paraded around by the right. But also I think there's a massive element of racism. It is the case that Māori and Pacifica people are disproportionately represented in beneficiaries currently, and that reinforces a narrative amongst largely upper middle class white people in society at large, or active voting base, that effectively these people are in some way like defective. We think it's a terrible trend that's perpetuated by the system. What happens then when you move away from that? At the point you have a universal basic income that is provided to everyone, it is the case then that you don't have this system of conditional benefits. That's one that entrenches particularly harmful narratives. At the point everyone gets it, this terrible stigma disappears. That's good because we don't treat people like they're not human beings, but it's also good because we get more optimal policy in terms of dealing with beneficiaries adequately. We want to have specific forms of support as opposed to simple jingoism that pervades politics currently. Second argument then, about automation. This is very straightforward. A lot of low-skilled and reputable jobs currently are disappearing, and they're disappearing at a rapid pace. At the same time, capital is increasingly being concentrated in the hands of the few. What do we do then? It's very simple. We take that money from them in the form of taxation, and we give it back to workers who increasingly are moving into fragile forms of work, where it won't be the case they have a salaried job across the space of a year, where they desperately need financial support in cases where they aren't going to work. We think there's a right owed to them, but also it's atrocious how the capitalists are allowed to do this. Final argument then, why does it make welfare more efficient? I realise efficiency is the shorthand often used by the right to stage at welfare, but it is the case that our current system of benefits is one where it is effectively you have a whole host of conditions that are designed by bureaucrats and arbitrarily applied. This is all a waste of time and money, and we think the UBI cuts away a lot of this cost and then puts that back into the public purses, which is then distributed through a UBI. At the end of this debate, a basic input is necessary for a changing world, one that is righteous and justice that we can no longer abide by. We propose.
Probably the closest thing that myself and other debaters that will be speaking to you today have seen to a universal income is the student living cost loan or student allowance that is given to all students who attend university. And I think it's a really pertinent example in this debate because it serves as an indicator of the effective bluntness of the UBI as a tool. Because while people like me and Zachary, who flat together, spend our student allowance on our rent, on our power bills, other students who have the full-blown support of their parents and have a lot of existing wealth behind them use it to splurge on trips to the bar over Saturday and Sunday and use it to go to concerts. We think the fact of the matter is that the UBI ignores the people who need money the most and gives it to the most privileged in our society, and that is something that we should not stand for in this debate. I'm going to bring you 3 points. Firstly, inherently why the UBI is unfair. Secondly, what sort of financial problems exist with it. And third, but before that, sorry, I'm going to give some rebuttal on Zach's case. Just quickly though, what is the kind of world that us on the negating team would like to see? We would like to see more targeted wage subsidies. We think this deals with the issues that Zach proposed around increasingly less labour-reliant technology and manufacturing, and we think this allows people to have the fulfilment of a job and solves issues of unemployment in that regard. Also though, we think that we would like to see more targeted welfare. We don't think we have to stand for the status quo on the side of the house when Zach was talking to you about things like humiliating case managers and the problems with the current welfare system. We would be perfectly fine on our side with drastically expanding welfare and making it far more easily accessible for people. We think, sure, it's unfair to make people who really need that welfare go and apply to a case manager, but we do think there is some way to discern between a person who's really struggling to get by and a person who's driving a Merc to their, to their inner city job and raking in cash. Let's deal with some rebuttal quickly. Firstly, Zach talked to you about labour dispersion. We think our model deals with this primarily, but secondly what we'd say is that we're still a while off and that it's unclear what sort of world will exist when this labour dispersion occurs. There are arguments to be made that a service-based economy will arise and the likes, and we don't think it's particularly clear in that regard. The second thing though, in regards to tax affordability, what Zach tried to tell you was that we could just simply tax more and that this would solve the issue. The problem with this is he ignores where the incidence of tax occurs, because tax often doesn't impact the wealthiest in our society because they can pay for accountants to get them out of it, but tax impacts the poor the most, who can't get out of tax with sneaky accounting practices, who can't avoid it in that regard. And so we think to the extent you need to expand tax to afford this system, we think that harms those people the most. I've already dealt with the content he brought on humane welfare. Firstly, why the UBI is unfair. Look, we think the fact of the matter is that it is ridiculous that the UBI proposes a system where people who are incredibly wealthy and occupy the highest positions of privilege in society are given the same amount of money as those who aren't in those positions. And we think it's really problematic, because what does that mean? It means when you go and tax a poor person, you've got to explain to them why you're taking money away from them to give to a Remuera resident who's earning millions of dollars a year. And we think there is a cost to that. Secondly though, we think that it actually taxes the wrong people, and I've talked to you about this already, that the actual incidence of tax predominantly falls on the poor more than the wealthy, and we think that is really problematic. We think that instead of funding a broad system such as UBI, it would be far better to drastically expand targeted welfare, to make it easily accessible for the people who need it most, and to make it way more effective for the people that need it most. So instead of doing some sort of scheme where you give everyone, I heard $175 a week. I don't know if you were replacing welfare how anyone could live off $175 a week in the current situation. You instead could double, triple, or quadruple that amount and give it to the people who actually need it, the people who can't afford to give their kids lunch in the mornings, the people who aren't being paid enough in their jobs. And we think that would help them the most. We think you can supplement existing government schemes for that reason. The second point then is fiscal sustainability, and this is going to be, I realise this is probably an unpopular point, but the fact of the matter is our current tax take is $72 billion, and if we were to fund a universal basic income to a reasonable level, I would say at around $20,000 a year, to give someone on no other form of income a decent living quality, that would allow us to fund 3.5 million people in this country, which obviously falls short of our current population estimates of around 4.5 million. Goodness. What does that mean? It means you actually have to increase taxes drastically, which we think is quite opposed by members of the right and makes it really difficult for you to pass through a universal basic income. But it also reduces the chances of that income being popularised worldwide. When other countries examine a UBI scheme and realise that they're going to have to pass broad taxation schemes, which isn't going to make them as governments very popular for their constituents. We think it constrains governments in that regard, and we think it's particularly problematic. At the end of the debate, we think there is a fundamental question. We think both teams agree that we want to drastically expand welfare, but where is that best spent? We think that it's best spent on the people who need it most, not on the Remuera mums who need a bit of extra money to top up their servicing fee for their Audi on Saturdays.
Been debating for quite a long time, and it's rare that I get put on a motion and on a side that I deeply agree with. So I'm quite happy to be here today and speak on this side of the motion. Because today, what I have to accept is that I'm incredibly lucky. I'm incredibly lucky to have been to university, but I'm also incredibly lucky to have had the bit inside me made that makes me work hard. I didn't earn any of those things, I didn't work for any of those things, I just happen to have a lot of those things. And a lot of people don't have a lot of those things. And I think we as a society owe a moral duty to those vulnerable people to provide for them provide for everyone that we conceivably can. So what I'm going to do for you in this speech is two things. I'm going to first respond to the various grab bag of points that Liam gave you about targeted welfare, and then I'm going to move on to talk about the value of security and why security is massively important to giving people alternatives in their lives so they're not shackled to the very few options that they have when they are in poverty and they can't access the resources that the state has put massive conditions on and continues to put more and more conditions on. So firstly, let's look at a few bits of rebuttal in relation to what Liam told you. Because he essentially wanted to say that it is unjust for us to give money to the Remuera family with 3 tractors that are Audis that charge around Auckland. They said it is unjust for us to have welfare that is universal rather than targeted just to the vulnerable. But the problem with that is that ignores the political reality in most countries around the world. And the political reality is that targeted welfare is often politically unsustainable. Because when you have targeted welfare, it often perpetuates negative stereotypes about beneficiaries in our society. And in lots of countries around the world, those negative stereotypes are often tied to race. They're often tied to indigenous populations in those countries. For example, in New Zealand, we have a long and illustrious history of beneficiary bashing that is tied to negative stereotypes around Māori. It is tied to negative stereotypes around beneficiaries being lazy and not working hard enough and not wanting to pull themselves up. Often, all of which are entirely untrue and are generated by circumstances and not by any inherent moral characteristics that those people actually bear. But what this means is that when you have targeted welfare and people continue to characterize beneficiaries as lazy, they continue to characterize beneficiaries as unworthy, that leads people to further cut welfare, to further impose conditions on welfare because they don't trust beneficiaries to spend it properly. They don't trust beneficiaries to make decisions for themselves. They take away their dignity. So this self-perpetuating cycle leads to a welfare system that is unsustainable for the people who need it most, which leads to people going to BINZ and pleading to fit into misidentified categories that don't adequately address the people who are most vulnerable. We think that that is economically unsustainable, but we also think that it creates a stigma that's massively harmful to the well-being of those people as they move forward, both in terms of how other people treat them and in terms of how they see themselves within the society. The second point I want to deal with quite quickly is that of effective taxation, because Liam wanted to say that rich people are really good at evading tax, essentially, because they can pay lawyers at EY or wherever it may be to devise, various Cayman Island schemes that allow them to avoid paying taxes. One of them is actually called the Irish Double Dutch Sandwich, and it is just insane. But we'll leave that for another day. So we're quite happy to support a broad basis of taxes because economists are reasonably in agreement that if you have a broad base of taxes like a land tax or an estate tax and a capital gains tax, across the board you're much more able to collect a lot more tax than when you just focus on income or when you just focus on particular parts of the way people hide their wealth. So we're happy to have a broad range. We think we're able to collect a lot of tax. Now I'm running out of time here. All right. Secondly, in terms of the value of security, we want to explain the value of security through one particular example, and that is standards in the workplace. We think this is quite a good example because when you don't have the security that something like a UBI provides to you, you're forced to make decisions that you don't want to make because being in poverty is essentially a dictatorship of no alternatives, right? You have to take a particular job. You have to do a particular thing because you don't have any other options of things that you could be doing. What that means is that certain jobs can have whatever standards they like, however low they may be, however dangerous they may be, however mentally unhealthy they may be, and you have to take that option because you don't have any other options. And the targeted welfare system systematically fails people in these scenarios because it says if you're not looking for work, if you're not accepting that horrible job, then you're not deserving of welfare either. And we think that fails people because you shouldn't be taking a job that's too dangerous for you. You shouldn't be taking a job that is massively detrimental to your mental health and to your family's health. So we think that as far as things like labour standards go, as one example of why security is valuable, it forces companies to have better labour standards because you're not going to take that job because you now have some security. It may not be a huge amount of security, but you have some security that means that you don't have to take the very worst jobs that are being offered for you. So in this debate, we have to ask the question, what is the most humane and broad-based and sustainable way for us to support the most vulnerable? And that's the UBI.
And finally,
we thought that it was a contradiction in the case that we heard from Adidia just then, for them to say that it is politically impossible and politically unsustainable for us to give a higher standard of living to the most vulnerable members of our society, but also that they are going to do things that for the past 100 years, for the past 1,000 years, have never successfully been implemented, although thousands of people, millions of people have tried. They supported things like a broad-based tax system. They supported things like capital gains taxes and land taxes. If it were true that those solutions were politically possible, that you could ever grapple those policy solutions and concessions away from the wealthy who control our political systems, then we would have a large number of options available for us in terms of how we would spend that money. We don't think it was ever realistic for them to get up here and say that they could just stand for doing those things and then accuse us of being the politically unrealistic people in this debate. Alright, let's talk about what it was that we heard from Adidia. Because Liam told you that we thought that one of the big problems with a UBI is that the incidence of tax that would be used to fund this does not fall on the people who optimally it would fall on. That is, it falls largely on people who cannot afford to pay that tax because the wealthy typically can get out of it. What did Adidia say? His response here didn't deal with the political reality. All it was that they supported on their side of the house a broad-based system of tax. We don't think that that is a system that is ever realistically going to be sustainable, precisely for the reasons that Adidia said, that the wealthy tend to control the political systems because they tend to control the resources of society, because there tend to always be loopholes in those systems, which means that they can exploit them through their accountants and their lawyers that they exclusively have access to. That at the very best in their case, wealthy people can simply shift their wealth offshore into foreign tax havens, which means they can always avoid those broad-based tax systems that Adidia wanted to talk about. We think the key problem here is the fact that the wealthy control the political systems precisely because they control the wealth. And we were the only team in this debate who supported shifting wealth away from the wealthy to the vulnerable, rather than just redistributing it to both the vulnerable and the wealthy as that side of the house wanted to do. What else did Adidia tell you at second? He said that they supported a degree of security because it meant that people could safely take jobs that they wanted and wouldn't be forced into jobs that were bad for them. Obviously we agree with that, but we think we provide that sort of security much better, right? Because for every dollar that they are spending on a millionaire in Remuera, we support giving money that you get in tax revenue, get from whatever source, to people who need that money a huge amount, right? So that means that if you're a person who's on an unemployment benefit, you'll see an expansion in that benefit. That means you get the kind of security Adidia wanted because there is no fear that if you lose your job, you'll be living in poverty, because under our side of the house, more of the money is being spent on those vulnerable.